"What kind of tattoo is that? Looks like a barcode from a hardware store." The young mechanics burst into laughter as the woman in grease-stained coveralls rolled up her sleeve to wipe the sweat from her forehead, revealing a peculiar black geometric pattern etched into her forearm. The shop foreman was about to tell her to cover it up when suddenly the entire garage fell silent. Through the bay doors walked a distinguished man in a crisp military uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and stars. 4 silver stars gleamed on his shoulders as he approached, his weathered face growing pale, his eyes locked on that tattoo with an expression of complete shock. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air compressors. "That marking ... It's been classified since 2011. Sarah Mitchell, 38 years old, stood 5 feet 6 inches, tall with calloused hands and permanently stained fingernails that told the story of countless hours, spent elbow-deep in engine blocks. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held a focus that seemed to cut through problems like a laser through steel. She worked at Murphy's Auto Repair on the outskirts of Fort Braxton, North Carolina, a small town where military families came to get their personal vehicles fixed at honest prices. The shop sat in a weathered brick building that had seen better decades, surrounded by the controlled chaos of spare parts, lifting equipment, and the constant smell of motor oil and metal shavings. Every morning at 6:30, Sarah would arrive. Before anyone else, her lunch packed in a dented metal box that looked like it had survived a war zone. She'd unlock the bay doors, fire up the air compressors, and begin her methodical inspection of the day's work orders. Her movements were precise, economical, like someone who had learned to waste neither time nor energy. She wore the same uniform every day, navy blue coveralls with Mitchell embroidered in simple white letters above the chest pocket, steel-toed boots that had been resoled more times than anyone could count, and a pair of work gloves that she treated like surgical instruments. The other mechanics at Murphy's were good people, mostly local guys who had grown up turning wrenches in their father's garages. They respected Sarah's work ethic and her ability to diagnose problems that left them scratching their heads, but they also kept their distance. There was something about her that suggested she had stories she wasn't telling, experiences that had carved lines around her eyes that seemed too deep for her age. She never joined them for beers after work, never talked about her past, and never complained about anything, no matter how frustrating the job became. Mitchell's got magic hands. Tommy Reeves, the lead mechanic, would tell customers when they expressed doubt about having a woman work on their truck. "She can make an engine purr like a house cat, and she's fixed things that 3 other shops said were totaled." It was true. Sarah had a reputation for taking on the impossible cases, the vehicles that other mechanics had given up on. She'd spend hours methodically testing every system, every connection, every component until she found the problem. Her diagnostic skills were legendary in the small community, and customers would specifically request her even when it meant waiting an extra week for an appointment. But despite her professional reputation, Sarah remained an outsider in the tight-knit community. She rented a small apartment above the hardware store, drove a 15-year-old Toyota pickup that she maintained with the same meticulous care she gave to customer vehicles, and spent her evenings reading technical manuals and watching educational videos about new automotive technologies. The townspeople saw her at the grocery store, the library, the gas station, but she moved through their world like a ghost, polite but distant, helpful but never personal. The tattoo on her forearm was usually hidden beneath her coveralls, but on particularly hot days when the garage temperature climbed above 90 degrees, she'd roll up her sleeves to work. The marking was unlike anything the other mechanics had ever seen. It wasn't a traditional military insignia, wasn't a personal symbol or artistic design. It looked almost industrial, like something that might be stamped on classified equipment or encoded on sensitive documents. The pattern was geometric, precise, with angles and lines that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical formula. Some of the guys joked that it looked like a blueprint. Others said it resembled a computer circuit board, but nobody could figure out what it actually represented. "Hey Sarah," Jake Morrison, one of the younger mechanics, had asked her once while they were both working on a particularly stubborn transmission. "What's the story with that ink on your arm?" "Never seen anything like it." Sarah had looked up from her work, her expression unreadable, and simply said, "It's personal." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it carried a finality that discouraged further questions. Jake had nodded and returned to his work, but the mystery of the tattoo became a regular topic of conversation among the staff. The speculation about Sarah's background was constant but quiet. Some thought she might have been in the military, given her discipline and the way she carried herself, but she never mentioned any service history. Others wondered if she had been an engineer or a technician in some high-tech industry before ending up in their small town. Her knowledge of automotive systems was encyclopedic, and she seemed to understand not just how things worked, but why they were designed the way they were. She could explain the physics behind fuel injection systems, the chemistry of different lubricants, and the metallurgy of various engine components with the kind of depth that suggested formal education, far beyond what most mechanics possessed. Murphy himself, the shop owner, had hired Sarah 3 years earlier when she walked in, with nothing but a sparse resume and a toolbox that looked like it had been through hell. He'd been skeptical at first, but she diagnosed and fixed a problem with his personal vehicle that 2 other shops had been unable to solve. Within a month, she'd become his most valuable employee, and within 6 months, customers were asking for her by name. He'd tried to promote her to shop supervisor, but she declined, saying she preferred to work with her hands rather than manage people. The military connection wasn't entirely hidden. Sarah knew too much about military vehicles, could identify the specifications of various transport trucks and support equipment with a glance, and had an uncanny ability to work on the personal vehicles of service members who came in from the nearby base. She understood their schedules, their deployment cycles, and their particular needs in ways that suggested personal experience. But when asked directly about military service, she would deflect the question with a slight smile and change the subject to whatever vehicle she was working on. Her apartment above the hardware store was as Spartan as a military barracks. The few people who had seen it described furniture that looked like it had been purchased from a surplus store. Walls decorated with nothing but a few automotive posters and technical diagrams, and a bookshelf filled with repair manuals and technical journals. There were no personal photographs, no mementos, no evidence of family or friends from her past. It was the living space of someone who had learned to travel light, to not get attached to places or things, to be ready to move on at a moment's notice. The mystery deepened when customers would occasionally comment on her unusual expertise. A retired Army sergeant had once mentioned that Sarah knew more about the electrical systems in his Humvee than the mechanics at the base motor pool. A Navy veteran had been amazed when she identified the exact specifications of his ship's auxiliary power unit just from his description of a similar system in his civilian truck. These interactions were brief, but they left people wondering how a small-town mechanic had acquired such specialized knowledge. Sarah's work ethic was legendary, but it was her attention to detail that really set her apart. She would spend extra time on every job, double-checking her work, testing systems that weren't even part of the original complaint, and ensuring that every vehicle left the shop in better condition than when it arrived. Her invoices were always conservative, her estimates always accurate, and her warranty work was virtually non-existent because she got things right the first time. This combination of skill and integrity had built her a reputation that extended far beyond the small town where she worked. The morning routine at Murphy's Auto Repair followed the same predictable pattern every day. Sarah would arrive in her weathered Toyota pickup at exactly 6:25, 5 minutes before her official start time. carrying her metal lunchbox and a thermos of black coffee that she'd brewed strong enough to wake the dead. She'd unlock the side door with a key that Murphy had given her after her first month, when he realized she was the most reliable employee he'd ever had. The shop was her domain in those quiet early minutes before the chaos of the day began. Her first task was always the same, a methodical walkthrough of every bay, checking that tools were properly secured, that equipment was functioning correctly, and that the previous day's work had been completed to her exacting standards. She moved through this inspection with the systematic precision of someone conducting a security sweep, her eyes noting details that others might miss. A loose bolt here, a potential safety hazard there, a tool left in the wrong place that could cause problems later. Other mechanics might have called it obsessive, but Sarah called it professional responsibility. The coveralls she wore were practical. Navy blue, heavy-duty cotton that could withstand the daily assault of grease, oil, and metal filings. The name Mitchell was embroidered in simple white block letters above the left chest pocket, and below that, a small patch that read Senior Technician in gold thread. Murphy had insisted on the title after her second year, even though Sarah had never requested any special recognition. Her tool belt was a work of art in itself, every item precisely positioned for maximum efficiency, each tool showing the wear patterns of constant, expert use. The other mechanics would begin filtering in around 7, bringing with them the comfortable chaos of working-class camaraderie. Tommy Reeves, the lead mechanic, was a local institution who had been turning wrenches since before Sarah was born. He'd grown up in Fort Braxton, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 kids while building engines in his spare time. Jake Morrison was 24, fresh out of automotive school, eager to prove himself but still learning the difference between textbook knowledge and practical experience. Luis Hernandez was the diesel specialist, a quiet man who spoke softly but could make semi-truck engines sing like concert orchestras. "Morning, Sarah," Tommy would call out as he fired up the coffee maker that had been gurgling and wheezing for the better part of a decade. "What's the damage today?" He'd gesture toward the work orders clipboard, where Murphy posted the day's assignments every morning like a general distributing battle plans. Sarah would nod, pour herself a cup of the industrial-strength coffee, and scan the list with the focused attention of someone reading mission briefings. The work orders told stories of automotive distress, transmission problems, electrical gremlins, engine knock, brake issues, and the occasional complete mystery that had stumped other shops. Sarah had developed a reputation for taking the impossible cases, the vehicles that arrived on flatbed trucks, because they'd defeated every other mechanic in a 50-mile radius. She approached each challenge with the same methodical intensity, like a detective solving a complex crime where every clue mattered and every assumption had to be tested. "Mitchell, you got the Johnson Suburban in Bay 3, Murphy would announce, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to trust Sarah's judgment completely. "They say it's been to 3 other shops. Nobody can figure out why it keeps overheating." Sarah would nod once, collect her diagnostic equipment, and disappear into the work bay like a surgeon entering an operating room. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The quiet, reserved woman who barely spoke during coffee breaks became a focused professional who seemed to communicate directly with the mechanical system she was examining. Her diagnostic process was poetry in motion. She'd start with the obvious, checking fluid levels, examining belts and hoses, testing the radiator cap pressure. But where other mechanics might stop at the surface problems, Sarah would dig deeper, following system connections like a detective, following a paper trail. She'd trace cooling system circuits, test electrical connections with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, and examine components that other mechanics might never consider. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to work in challenging conditions, who had developed the ability to diagnose problems by touch as much as by sight. The other mechanics had learned to respect her space when she was Working, there was an intensity to her concentration that discouraged casual conversation, a focus that seemed to create an invisible barrier around whatever vehicle she was examining. She'd work for hours without breaking, occasionally making notes on a pad that she kept in her chest pocket, sometimes photographing unusual wear patterns or component configurations with a phone that looked like it had been designed for military use rather than civilian convenience. "She's got some kind of sixth sense," Jake would whisper to Louise during their lunch breaks, watching Sarah work through the window of the break room. Last week, she diagnosed a problem with the Hendersons' pickup truck just by listening to it idle. Didn't even open the hood. Told them exactly which injector was failing and how long it had been running lean. Louise would nod thoughtfully, remembering his own experiences with Sarah's uncanny diagnostic abilities. She seemed to understand vehicles at a level that went beyond mechanical knowledge, as if she could hear conversations between components that others couldn't detect. The precision of her work extended to everything she touched. Her toolbox was organized with military precision, every item in its designated location, every surface clean and properly maintained. She'd sharpen cutting tools that other mechanics would have discarded, calibrate measuring instruments that others would have trusted to remain accurate, and maintain equipment that others would have run until it failed. Her workspace was always immaculate, not from obsessive cleanliness, but from the kind of systematic organization that suggested someone who had learned to work in environments where disorder could mean disaster. Customer interactions revealed another layer of Sarah's mysterious expertise. When military families brought their personal vehicles to Murphy's, they often requested Sarah specifically. Word had spread through the base community that she understood their unique needs, their deployment schedules, their concerns about vehicle reliability during extended absences. She'd modify maintenance schedules to accommodate deployment timelines, recommend upgrades that would improve reliability in harsh conditions, and provide detailed instructions for maintenance that could be performed by spouses who weren't mechanically inclined. "She knows things about military vehicles that I learned the hard way in 3 tours overseas," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez had told Murphy after Sarah had solved a persistent electrical problem in his personally owned truck. "She understands the modifications we make, the conditions we operate in, the way we maintain equipment when parts are scarce and time is limited. Most civilian mechanics don't get that, but she does." Murphy had filed that comment away with the growing collection of similar observations from customers who seemed to recognize something in Sarah that others missed. The mystery of her background deepened during specialized repair situations. When a local contractor brought in a piece of heavy equipment that had been modified for military use, Sarah had diagnosed the problem in minutes, explaining the interaction between civilian and military electrical systems with the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested hands-on experience. When a retired special operations veteran had brought in a motorcycle that had been heavily modified for desert operations, Sarah had not only understood the modifications, but had suggested improvements that the veteran admitted he'd never considered. Her knowledge extended beyond mechanical systems into areas that seemed unusual for a civilian mechanic. She understood military communication protocols, could identify the specifications of various military vehicles by sight, and occasionally made references to equipment and procedures that suggested first-hand familiarity with military operations. But when pressed for details, she would deflect questions with the same polite but firm boundaries that she maintained around all personal topics. The tattoo on her forearm remained a constant source of speculation and curiosity. On days when the temperature in the shop climbed above 90 degrees, she'd roll up her sleeves to work, revealing the geometric pattern that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. The marking was precise, angular, with elements that seemed to follow some kind of technical specification. Some of the mechanics thought it looked like a schematic diagram. Others suggested it resembled a topographical map, but nobody could Identify what it actually represented or what it might signify. The first hint that Sarah Mitchell possessed extraordinary skills came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Henderson's grandson brought in a vehicle that had stumped every mechanic in 3 counties. The 19-year-old college student had inherited his grandfather's 1987 Chevrolet pickup truck, a vehicle that had been running perfectly until it suddenly developed what he described as a sound like a dying whale mixed with a garbage disposal eating rocks. 4 different shops had examined the truck, replaced various components, and charged him nearly $2,000, but the mysterious noise persisted and was actually getting worse. Sarah was assigned to the case after Murphy had exhausted his other options. She approached the truck with her usual methodical precision, but something was different this time. Instead of immediately opening the hood or crawling underneath to examine the chassis, she stood perfectly still next to the driver's door and listened. Her head was tilted at a specific angle, her eyes closed in concentration, and her entire body seemed to be absorbing information through her ears. After exactly 3 minutes of this unusual diagnostic technique, she walked to the passenger side and repeated the process, then moved to the rear of the vehicle for another silent listening session. "Turn it off," she called to the young man who was sitting behind the wheel, anxiety written across his face as he contemplated the prospect of another expensive repair bill. The engine fell silent, and Sarah immediately crawled underneath the truck with a precision that surprised everyone watching. She wasn't randomly searching for problems. She moved directly to a specific location near the transmission mount and began examining a component that the other mechanics hadn't even considered. Within minutes, she emerged from beneath the vehicle with a small metal bracket that looked completely unremarkable to the untrained eye. "Harmonic dampener mount has a stress fracture," she announced, holding up the bracket and pointing to a hairline crack that was barely visible even under direct light. "The fracture is allowing the transmission to vibrate at a frequency that resonates through the frame. It's not dangerous, but it'll get louder until you replace this part." The young man stared at the innocuous piece of metal that had caused so much trouble and expense. "How did you know to look there?" he asked, genuinely amazed that such a small component could create such a dramatic sound. Sarah's response was characteristically understated. "Experience teaches you to listen for what doesn't belong." But Tommy Reeves, who had been watching the entire diagnostic process, knew that what he'd witnessed went far beyond normal automotive experience. He'd been fixing cars for 30 years, and he'd never seen anyone diagnose a problem like that without even looking at the engine or checking the obvious systems. Sarah had identified the exact source of the problem through acoustic analysis alone, demonstrating a level of technical expertise that seemed almost supernatural. The precision of her diagnostic technique became a regular source of amazement among the shop's customers and staff. A week later, she identified a failing wheel bearing in a customer's sedan by observing the wear pattern on the tire tread, correctly predicting that the bearing would fail completely within 200 miles. She diagnosed a failing fuel pump relay in a delivery truck by analyzing the pattern of electrical interference on the radio, and she detected a developing crack in an engine block by recognizing a subtle change in the resonance of the cooling system. Her knowledge of vehicle systems extended into areas that seemed impossible for someone who had learned her trade in civilian automotive shops. When a local National Guard unit brought in several Humvees for maintenance during a weekend training exercise, Sarah demonstrated familiarity with military vehicle specifications that impressed even the unit's motor sergeant. She correctly identified modification packages, understood the differences between various armor configurations, and knew maintenance procedures that weren't included in civilian training programs. How does a civilian mechanic know about the electrical grounding modifications in the M1151 enhanced armament carrier? Staff Sergeant Williams had asked Murphy after watching Sarah efficiently diagnose and repair a complex electrical problem in one of the military vehicles. Murphy had no answer for that question, but he was beginning to accumulate a collection of similar observations from customers who seemed to recognize expertise in Sarah that went far beyond normal automotive knowledge. The mystery deepened when she demonstrated knowledge of specialized tools and techniques that weren't typically taught in civilian mechanics programs. She owned diagnostic equipment that was more sophisticated than what most independent shops could afford, and she used testing procedures that seemed to follow military, technical manual specifications rather than civilian automotive standards. Her approach to problem solving was systematic and thorough in ways that suggested formal training in environments where mechanical failures could have life or death consequences. Her physical capabilities also set her apart from typical automotive technicians. She could lift engine components that would normally require two people, work in confined spaces for extended periods without apparent discomfort, and maintain precise motor control even when working in awkward positions or challenging conditions. Her endurance was remarkable. She could work for 10 or 12 hours without showing signs of fatigue, and her concentration never seemed to waver even during the most complex diagnostic procedures. The way she handled pressure situations revealed another layer of her unusual background. When Murphy's shop was contracted to provide emergency roadside assistance for a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate, Sarah responded with a level of calm efficiency that impressed even the state police officers who were managing the scene. She assessed multiple vehicles simultaneously, prioritized repairs based on safety considerations rather than convenience, and coordinated with emergency responders using communication protocols that seemed more military than civilian. She took charge of that accident scene like she'd been doing it her whole career. Officer Martinez told Murphy the following week, "Most civilian mechanics get overwhelmed when they're dealing with multiple damaged vehicles and emergency responders. But she treated it like a routine operation. She knew exactly how to work around the ambulances and fire trucks, understood our radio protocols, and kept everyone informed about vehicle conditions without getting in the way of medical personnel." Sarah's understanding of safety procedures also suggested specialized training. She could identify potential hazards that other mechanics might miss, understood the proper protocols for handling damaged fuel systems and electrical components, and demonstrated knowledge of decontamination procedures that went far beyond normal automotive safety training. When a customer brought in a vehicle that had been involved in a chemical spill, Sarah immediately recognized the type of contamination and implemented isolation procedures that prevented potential health risks for everyone in the shop. Her expertise with electronic systems was particularly noteworthy. Modern vehicles contain complex computer networks that control everything from engine management to entertainment systems, and diagnosing problems in these integrated systems requires sophisticated understanding of both hardware and software components. Sarah could navigate these electronic systems with the skill of a computer engineer, identifying firmware conflicts, diagnosing sensor malfunctions, and even reprogramming control modules when necessary. The precision of her electronic diagnostic work impressed customers who had previously taken their vehicles to dealership service departments for complex electrical problems. She could trace circuit malfunctions through miles of wiring harnesses, identify intermittent connection problems that other technicians couldn't duplicate, and resolve software conflicts that required detailed understanding of how different vehicle systems communicated with each other. Her knowledge extended to emerging automotive technologies that many mechanics were still learning to understand. Electric vehicle systems, hybrid powertrains, advanced driver assistance features, and integrated communication systems were all within her area of expertise. She understood the safety protocols for working with high-voltage electrical systems, knew the diagnostic procedures for battery management systems, and could explain the operation of regenerative braking systems with the depth of knowledge typically found only among automotive engineers. But perhaps most remarkably, Sarah seemed to anticipate technological problems before they became apparent to others. She would recommend preventive maintenance for systems that appeared to be functioning normally, suggest component replacements before failures occurred, and identify potential reliability issues that wouldn't become obvious for months or years. This predictive ability suggested not just mechanical knowledge, but understanding of how complex systems degrade over time under different operating conditions. The first attempt to access Sarah Mitchell's employment records came 3 months after she had been hired at Murphy's Auto Repair. Murphy himself had initiated the background check, not out of suspicion, but because he wanted to promote her to shop supervisor and needed to verify her qualifications for insurance purposes. What should have been a routine verification process instead opened a door into a maze of bureaucratic walls and classified information that made no sense for a civilian automotive technician. The employment verification company that Murphy's insurance carrier used for background checks was a reputable firm that had been conducting similar investigations for 20 years. They specialized in confirming work histories, educational credentials, and professional certifications for employees in various industries. When they input Sarah's personal information into their standard database searches, the results were immediately flagged by their automated systems as requiring special handling. Instead of the typical employment history that might show previous jobs at automotive dealerships, technical schools, or other repair facilities, Sarah's records contained gaps, redactions, and classification levels that the verification company had never encountered in civilian employment checks. The Social Security Administration's employment records showed a 10-year period where Sarah's income was reported by an entity identified only as Federal Contractor 7749 Delta, with no additional details about the nature of the work, the location of employment, or the specific duties performed. Tax records from the Internal Revenue Service contained similar anomalies, showing income levels that fluctuated dramatically from year to year, with withholdings that suggested employment in foreign countries or special tax districts that applied to government contractors working in classified environments. Educational records presented their own mysteries. Sarah's high school transcripts were available and showed excellent grades in mathematics, physics, and mechanical engineering courses, but her post-secondary education was documented through a series of certificates and training completions that were issued by institutions with names like Advanced Technical Training Center, Facility 19, and Specialized Systems Institute, location classified. These weren't traditional colleges or technical schools. They appeared to be government training facilities that provided intensive education in specific technical specialties. The most puzzling aspect of the background investigation was the response from federal agencies when the verification company attempted to confirm Sarah's employment history. Instead of the standard form letters that typically confirmed or denied employment at government agencies, the responses came in the form of phone calls from security officers who asked detailed questions about why the information was being requested, who was conducting the investigation, and what level of security clearance the investigators possessed. These conversations were brief and professional, but they made it clear that Sarah's employment history was protected by classification levels that extended far beyond normal government worker privacy protections. Credit history investigations revealed additional anomalies that suggested a background involving classified government work. Sarah's credit report showed periods where her address was listed as a POFPO, military postal codes that were used for overseas military installations, followed by periods where her address was simply listed as federal housing, location withheld. Her credit accounts showed patterns consistent with someone who had spent extended periods in remote locations where normal banking services weren't available, with large deposits followed by months of minimal account activity. Banking records Access through the routine employment verification process showed wire transfers from accounts that were traced back to defense contractors and government agencies that specialized in classified operations. The amounts and timing of these transfers suggested compensation for specialized services rather than regular salary payments, with bonuses and hazard pay allocations that were typically associated with high-risk assignments in dangerous locations. Professional certifications and training records created another layer of mystery. Sarah possessed certifications in areas that seemed unusual for civilian automotive work: explosive ordnance disposal, chemical decontamination procedures, field maintenance of classified electronic systems, and emergency medical techniques that were specifically designed for combat environments. She held commercial driver's licenses for multiple vehicle classes, including certifications for operating specialized military transport equipment, and her training records showed completion of courses in desert survival, cold weather operations, and high-altitude mechanical procedures. Medical records, protected by privacy laws but partially accessible through the employment verification process, contained references to specialized vaccinations that were required for travel to specific geographic regions known for hosting classified military operations. Immunization records showed protection against diseases that were endemic to parts of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, with vaccination dates that corresponded to periods when Sarah's employment records showed income from classified federal contractors, security clearance databases, which were supposed to be completely inaccessible to civilian employers, somehow flagged Sarah's name during the background investigation process. The automated response indicated that her security clearance status was inactive administrative hold, which suggested that she had once possessed high-level clearances that had been suspended rather than revoked. The database entry included a notation that any inquiries about her clearance status should be directed to a specific office within the Department of Defense that specialized in personnel who had been involved in classified operations. Personal references listed on her original employment application presented their own challenges for investigators. The 3 references she had provided were all individuals with military ranks rather than civilian job titles, and when contacted, they gave responses that were professionally courteous but remarkably uninformative. Colonel James Mitchell, no relation, despite the shared surname, confirmed that he had known Sarah in a professional capacity, but declined to discuss the nature of their working relationship. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez acknowledged that Sarah possessed exceptional technical skills, but stated that she was not authorized to provide details about Sarah's specific qualifications or experience. Financial investigations revealed investment accounts and retirement savings that were managed by financial institutions that specialized in serving military and government personnel. The portfolio composition suggested someone who had received financial advice, specifically tailored to individuals who spent extended periods in combat zones, with investments that were designed to provide long-term growth while accommodating the irregular income patterns typical of personnel involved in classified operations. Property ownership records showed that Sarah had never owned real estate, despite having sufficient income to qualify for mortgage during several periods of her employment history. This pattern was consistent with individuals who maintained transient lifestyles due to the classified nature of their work, unable to establish permanent residential ties due to security requirements and deployment schedules that could change. Without advance notice, the vehicle registration records revealed a pattern of ownership that favored reliable, low-profile vehicles that could be quickly abandoned if necessary. Sarah had owned a series of used pickup trucks and sedans that were purchased with cash, registered for relatively short periods, and then sold without apparent regard for depreciation or financial loss. This pattern suggested someone who valued mobility and anonymity over financial efficiency, treating vehicles as temporary resources rather than long-term investments. Insurance records showed coverage patterns that were designed to provide protection in high-risk environments. Her health insurance had included coverage for medical evacuation services, treatment at military medical facilities, and specialized care for injuries that were typically associated with combat operations. Her life insurance policies included beneficiaries who were identified only by military ranks and unit designations, rather than personal names and addresses. Communication records, to the extent that they were accessible through legal employment. Verification procedures showed patterns that were consistent with individuals who had spent significant time in locations where normal telecommunications infrastructure was unreliable or non-existent. Sarah's phone service history included extended periods of account suspension followed by reactivation from different geographic regions, and her internet service records showed connections from military bases and government facilities rather than residential addresses. The most significant discovery came when the verification company attempted to confirm Sarah's professional certifications through the organizations that had supposedly issued them. Several of the certifying bodies turned out to be front organizations for classified training programs, with official addresses that led to post office boxes registered to defense contractors. When investigators attempted to contact these organizations directly, they were referred to government offices that required security clearances for any meaningful information exchange. Professional licensing records revealed certifications that required practical experience in environments that weren't available to civilian technicians. Sarah held certifications for maintaining and repairing equipment in extreme environmental conditions, including Arctic operations, desert deployments, and high-altitude maintenance procedures. She possessed specialized training in working with equipment that had been modified for classified applications, and her certification renewals showed continuing education in technologies that weren't typically available outside of military and intelligence applications. The cumulative effect of these discoveries was a picture of someone whose professional background involved classified government work at the highest levels, but whose current employment at a small-town automotive repair shop represented a complete departure from that previous career. The gaps, redactions, and classification markers in her records suggested involvement in operations that were so sensitive that even confirming their existence required special authorization from federal security agencies. The distinguished man who walked through the bay doors of Murphy's Auto Repair that Tuesday afternoon carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. 4 silver stars gleamed on the shoulders of his dress uniform and the ribbons decorating his chest told the story of a career spent in the world's most dangerous places. General William Harrison, recently retired from his position as commander of Special Operations Command, had driven to the small North Carolina town for what he had told his aide was a personal errand, though he hadn't specified the nature of that business. The general's presence in the modest repair shop created an immediate stir among the mechanics, who had never seen such high-ranking military brass in their working environment. Tommy Reeves quickly wiped his hands on a shop rag and approached the distinguished visitor, assuming that someone of that rank must be there on official business related to the nearby military base. "Good afternoon, sir," Tommy said with the respectful tone that civilians typically used when addressing senior military officers. "How can we help you today?" General Harrison's attention, however, was completely focused on the woman in navy blue coveralls who was working methodically on a transmission in Bay 3. Sarah Mitchell had her back to the entrance, her sleeves rolled up to deal with the afternoon heat, and she was using a precision torque wrench to adjust components with the kind of systematic care that spoke of extensive experience with complex mechanical systems. The general watched her work with the intensity of someone confirming a long-held suspicion, his weathered face showing a mixture of recognition and something that might have been relief. "Excuse me," the general called out, his voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of commanding elite military units. "Would you mind turning around?" Sarah's hand stilled on the torque wrench, and for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, she remained motionless. When she finally straightened and turned to face the visitor, her expression was carefully neutral, but those who knew how to read body language could see the sudden tension in her shoulders, the way her stance shifted into something that resembled a military bearing despite her civilian clothing. The geometric tattoo on her forearm was clearly visible, and when General Harrison's eyes locked onto that marking, his face went through a transformation that was remarkable to witness. The professional composure that had been maintained through decades of military command cracked slightly, revealing an expression of amazement mixed with profound respect. He approached her slowly, his eyes never leaving the intricate pattern that was etched into her skin, and the atmosphere in the shop changed as everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Omega 7, the general said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Phoenix Company, Joint Task Force Blackwater. The words meant nothing to the civilian mechanics who were watching the exchange, but Sarah's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her entire posture changed, shifting from the casual stance of a working mechanic to the rigid attention position of a soldier, recognizing a superior officer. The transformation was so complete that it seemed like a different person was standing in the same coveralls, someone who had been hiding in plain sight behind the facade of ordinary automotive work. "General Harrison," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a formality that none of the shop employees had ever heard from her before. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, sir." The general studied her face with the intensity of someone confirming details that he had memorized years earlier, looking for changes that time and civilian life might have created in someone he had known in very different circumstances. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared experiences that couldn't be discussed in present company. "At ease, Sergeant," the general said, using a rank that caused several of the mechanics to exchange confused glances. Sarah had never mentioned military service, had never indicated that she possessed any kind of military rank or background, yet here was a four-star general addressing her with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her in a professional military capacity. The incongruity was jarring for people who had worked alongside her for years without suspecting that her background involved anything more complex than civilian automotive training. General Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that was intended for Sarah alone but was still audible to the others in the shop. "I heard rumors that you were working somewhere in this area," he said, his tone carrying a mixture of concern and curiosity. "When I confirmed the location, I had to see for myself. A lot of people have been wondering what happened to Omega 7 after the unit was deactivated." Sarah's expression remained carefully controlled, but there was something in her eyes that suggested this conversation was awakening memories that she had worked hard to keep buried. "I'm just a mechanic now, sir," Sarah replied, her words carefully chosen to discourage further discussion about her previous career. "I fix cars and trucks for people who need reliable transportation." But the general wasn't accepting that deflection, and his next words made it clear that he understood exactly who he was talking to and what her background actually involved. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, using her name with the kind of emphasis that suggested it carried weight far beyond what anyone in the shop had imagined. "You were never just anything." The general's eyes moved to the tattoo on her forearm, and his expression became even more serious. "That marking represents something that very few people in the world have earned the right to carry," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone delivering an official commendation. Omega 7 completed 17 classified missions over a 4-year period, operating in conditions that would have been considered impossible by conventional military standards. Every one of those missions was successful, and the lives saved through those operations number in the thousands. The impact of these words on the shop employees was profound. Tommy Reeves found himself looking at Sarah with completely different eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet mechanic he had worked alongside for 3 years with the picture that was emerging of someone who had been involved in the most classified and dangerous military operations. Jake Morrison's mouth had fallen open slightly as he processed the implications of what he was hearing, and Luis Hernandez was shaking his head in amazement at the realization that he had been working next to someone whose background was so extraordinary. General Harrison continued his impromptu briefing, apparently deciding that some level of recognition was long overdue. Sergeant Mitchell's specialization was precision technical operations in hostile environments, he explained, addressing his comments to the room in general while keeping his eyes on Sarah. She could maintain, repair, and modify complex systems under conditions that would defeat most trained technicians. Desert environments, Arctic conditions, high-altitude operations, combat zones where equipment failure could mean mission failure and loss of life. The general paused, studying Sarah's face as if searching for signs of how she was processing this unexpected recognition. The Omega Force classification system was created for personnel whose skills and experience were considered so valuable that their identities and backgrounds required permanent protection, he continued. Even after retirement from active duty, personnel with Omega classifications maintain security protections that extend for the remainder of their lives. Their service records remain classified. Their true contributions to national security remain secret, and their transition to civilian life is monitored to ensure their continued safety. Sarah's discomfort with this public revelation was becoming increasingly apparent, but General Harrison seemed determined to provide some level of recognition for service that had never been officially acknowledged. The geometric pattern in that tattoo, he said, pointing to the marking on her forearm, represents a coordinate system that was used for navigation and targeting in classified operations. Each element of the design corresponds to specific geographic locations where Omega-7 conducted successful missions. It's not just a tattoo. It's a permanent record of service that saved lives and protected national interests in ways that can never be publicly recognized. The revelation was transforming everyone's understanding of who Sarah Mitchell actually was and what her presence in their small town represented. Murphy, who had been listening from the office doorway, found himself reassessing every interaction he had ever had with his most skilled employee, understanding now why her capabilities had always seemed to exceed what her background should have provided. The customers who had been impressed by her unusual expertise now had an explanation for knowledge that had seemed almost supernatural in its depth and precision. General Harrison reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a small object that looked like a challenge coin, the kind of commemorative token that military units use to recognize significant achievements or milestones. This represents completion of the classified operations that Omega-7 conducted between 2007 and 2011, he said, offering the coin to Sarah with the formality of an official presentation. It's long overdue recognition for service that deserved medals that could never be awarded and commendations that could never be made public. Sarah accepted the coin with hands that betrayed a slight tremor, the first sign of emotion that any of her civilian colleagues had ever seen from her. She studied the design briefly, and those watching could see that the markings on the coin corresponded in some way to elements of the tattoo on her arm, creating a connection between her permanent marking and the official recognition that was finally being provided years after her service had ended. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying a depth of emotion that surprised everyone who heard it. "I never expected any kind of recognition." The general's response revealed something about the nature of the service that Sarah had provided, and the kind of sacrifice that classified operations required from the people who conducted them. "Personnel with Omega classifications gave up more than most people realize," he said quietly. "Normal careers, normal relationships, normal lives, all sacrificed for operations that the world needed, but could never know about." The silence that followed General Harrison's recognition stretched across the shop like a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant hum of air compressors and the occasional clink of tools being set down by mechanics who had stopped working to absorb what they were witnessing. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, the commemorative coin in her hands, her eyes focused on something beyond the concrete walls of the garage, as if she were seeing memories that had been carefully locked away for years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that transformed her from the quiet mechanic they had known into someone whose experiences dwarfed anything they could imagine. Omega-7 was dissolved in 2011, she said, her words measured and precise, after our final operation in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. We were a 4-person technical reconnaissance unit specializing in equipment recovery and system neutralization in environments where conventional forces couldn't operate effectively. She paused, looking at General Harrison as if seeking permission to continue with details that had been classified for over a decade. The general nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to convey authorization for a level of disclosure that was rarely permitted. Our primary mission profile involved infiltrating hostile territory to recover or destroy advanced military technology that had fallen into enemy hands, Sarah continued, her tone taking on the clinical precision of someone delivering an operational briefing. We operated in teams of 4, a communications specialist, an explosive ordnance disposal expert, a field medic, and a technical systems specialist. I was the technical systems specialist for Phoenix Company, responsible for identifying, accessing, and either recovering or permanently disabling complex military equipment under extreme time pressure in hostile environments. The mechanics gathered around her were struggling to process the transformation they were witnessing. This was the same woman who had quietly fixed their equipment for 3 years, who had eaten lunch alone in the corner of the break room, who had deflected personal questions with polite but firm boundaries. Now she was describing a career that sounded like something from a classified military thriller, operations that had required skills and courage far beyond anything they had imagined. The Hindu Kush operation was designated Phoenix Recovery 7, Sarah continued, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that had been sealed away for professional and personal reasons. Intelligence had confirmed that an advanced drone platform containing classified targeting systems had been shot down in Taliban-controlled territory approximately 48 hours earlier. The technology in that platform could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands or be transferred to hostile foreign governments. Conventional recovery operations were impossible due to the terrain and the enemy force concentration in the area. General Harrison added context that helped explain the significance of what Sarah was describing. The drone platform contained targeting algorithms and sensor packages that represented 5 years of classified research and development, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been briefed on the strategic implications. If that technology had been reverse engineered by hostile forces, it would have compromised multiple ongoing operations and potentially cost hundreds of lives. Phoenix Recovery 7 was the only option for preventing that outcome. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the general's summary before continuing with details that painted a picture of an operation that existed at the extreme edge of what was militarily possible. The insertion was conducted at night via high altitude parachute drop from an aircraft that officially was never in Afghan airspace, she said. We landed approximately 12 kilometers from the crash site and had to traverse terrain that included rock faces, glacial formations, and areas that were actively patrolled by enemy forces. The operational window was 36 hours maximum before Taliban forces were expected to remove the platform to a location where recovery would be impossible. The precision with which Sarah described these events was remarkable, suggesting a level of detail retention that spoke to the intensity of the experiences she was recounting. The crash site was located at an altitude of approximately 11,000 feet, in a narrow valley that provided only one viable approach route, she continued. Initial reconnaissance confirmed that the platform was largely intact but had suffered damage to the primary recovery systems. Standard extraction procedures would not be possible due to the weight of the platform and the impossibility of helicopter operations in that terrain and enemy environment. Jake Morrison, who had been listening with growing amazement, found his voice long enough to ask a question that reflected what everyone was thinking. How did you get something that heavy out of a place like that? Sarah's response revealed the kind of improvisation and technical expertise that had made Omega Force operations legendary among the small community of people who knew they had existed. We didn't extract the platform, Sarah said simply. My job was to access the classified systems, download the essential data to portable storage devices, and then completely destroy the platform using thermite charges that would ensure no recoverable technology remained. She paused, and for the first time since beginning her account, a slight smile crossed her face. The challenging part wasn't destroying the platform. The challenging part was accessing the data storage systems after they had been damaged in the crash and modified by the manufacturer to prevent exactly the kind of field access we needed to perform. The technical complexity of what she was describing began to emerge as Sarah provided details about the operation that had defined the end of her military career. The platform's data storage systems were protected by multiple encryption layers, physical security measures, and fail-safe protocols that were designed to permanently destroy the data if unauthorized access was attempted. She explained, under normal circumstances, accessing that data would require specialized laboratory equipment and weeks of careful analysis. We had approximately 6 hours to complete the download before enemy forces would discover our location. General Harrison's expression showed both pride and concern as Sarah described the technical challenges that had made the operation so dangerous. The manufacturer's security protocols included biometric verification systems, encrypted key exchanges, and physical destruction mechanisms that would activate if the proper access procedures weren't followed exactly. He added, "What Sergeant Mitchell accomplished in that cave was the equivalent of performing microsurgery on a bomb that was designed to explode if anyone touched it incorrectly." The picture that was emerging was of someone whose technical skills operated at a level that was almost incomprehensible to civilian mechanics, no matter how skilled they might be in their own specialties. Sarah had been required to understand complex computer systems, military encryption protocols, and explosive devices simultaneously, while working under extreme time pressure in hostile territory where discovery would mean certain death. The precision and expertise she had demonstrated at Murphy's Auto Repair suddenly seemed like a minor application of capabilities that had been developed for life or death situations. The data download required manually bypassing 7 different security systems, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the focused intensity of someone reliving technical challenges that had pushed her abilities to their absolute limits. Each bypass had to be performed in a specific sequence, and any error would have triggered the destruction protocols and eliminated any possibility of recovering the classified information. The work had to be performed in complete darkness using only infrared guidance systems, because any visible light would have been detected by enemy surveillance. Luis Hernandez, who specialized in the complex electronic systems of modern diesel engines, found himself marveling at the level of technical sophistication that Sarah's military work had required. "How did you learn to work with systems that complex?" he asked, genuinely curious about the training that could prepare someone for such demanding technical operations. Sarah's response revealed something about the intensity and specialization of Omega Force preparation that went far beyond conventional military training. Omega Force training lasted 18 months and covered everything from advanced electronics and computer systems to field medicine and survival techniques, she said. The technical systems training included hands-on experience with every piece of classified military equipment that we might encounter in the field, plus extensive cross-training on foreign military technologies that we might need to understand or disable. We learned to work with systems that most military technicians never see, and we learned to improvise solutions when standard procedures weren't applicable to field conditions. The scope of the training that Sarah described painted a picture of preparation that was designed to create technical specialists who could operate independently in any environment and deal with virtually any technology they might encounter. We trained on captured foreign equipment, prototype systems that hadn't been deployed yet, and classified platforms that officially didn't exist, she continued. The goal was to ensure that we could understand, access, or destroy any military technology regardless of its origin or complexity, working under conditions that would make normal technical procedures impossible. Tommy Reeves, who had been absorbing this revelation about his colleague's background, finally asked the question that seemed most relevant to their current situation. Why did you end up here, fixing civilian vehicles, after doing that kind of work? Sarah's expression became more serious as she considered how to explain a transition that represented a complete departure from the most demanding technical work imaginable to the relatively simple challenges of automotive repair. After Phoenix Recovery 7, Omega Force was officially disbanded, she said quietly. The political climate had changed, and the kind of operations we conducted were no longer considered politically acceptable. Personnel with Omega classifications were given the choice of reassignment to conventional units or separation from military service with full benefits and security protections. I chose separation because I had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes, and I wanted to find a way to use my technical skills in an environment where success didn't depend on anyone's survival. General Harrison's expression showed understanding and approval of the choice that Sarah had made. Transitioning from classified operations to civilian life is one of the most difficult challenges that military personnel face, he said. Personnel with Omega classifications face additional complications because their skills and experience can't be discussed or used as credentials for civilian employment. They have to essentially rebuild their professional identities from scratch, finding ways to apply extraordinary capabilities in ordinary environments. The weight of what Sarah had given up in order to find a normal life was beginning to become apparent to everyone present. She had walked away from a career where her skills were literally irreplaceable, where her contributions could save thousands of lives, where her expertise was valued at the highest levels of military and government leadership. In exchange, she had chosen the quiet satisfaction of fixing civilian vehicles for people who had no idea of the extraordinary capabilities that she brought to their simple mechanical problems. The transformation in how everyone at Murphy's Auto Repair viewed Sarah Mitchell was immediate and profound, like watching a photograph suddenly shift into focus after years of blurry approximation. Tommy Reeves, who had worked alongside her for 3 years, found himself mentally reviewing every interaction they had shared, every piece of advice she had offered, every technical problem she had solved with what he had assumed was simply exceptional mechanical intuition. Now he understood that her intuition was actually the application of technical knowledge that had been acquired through training that most people couldn't imagine and refined through operations where failure meant death. The change in the shop's atmosphere was palpable in the days following General Harrison's visit. Conversations that had once been casual and familiar now carried an undercurrent of respect mixed with uncertainty about how to interact with someone whose background was so far beyond their experience. Jake Morrison, who had once joked about Sarah's methodical approach to diagnostic work, now watched her with the fascination of someone observing a master craftsman whose expertise transcended the immediate task at hand. The precision that had once seemed slightly obsessive now appeared as the natural application of skills that had been honed in environments where attention to detail was literally a matter of life and death. Sarah herself seemed both relieved and uncomfortable with the revelation of her background. The careful boundaries she had maintained around personal conversation were no longer necessary. But the sudden shift from anonymity to recognition created its own challenges. Customers who had once treated her as simply another mechanic now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and deference that made routine interactions more complex than they had been when her capabilities were hidden behind the facade of ordinary automotive work. The most significant change came in how military personnel from the nearby base responded to news of Sarah's presence in the local community. Word spread quickly through the military networks that connected active-duty personnel, veterans, and their families, creating a steady stream of visitors who came to Murphy's Auto Repair, not just for vehicle maintenance, but to meet someone whose reputation had become legendary in certain military circles. These visitors didn't come seeking autographs or celebrity encounters. They came with the respectful recognition that one professional extends to another whose achievements command admiration. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, brought his personal truck to the shop specifically to meet Sarah and express gratitude for operations that had protected personnel who never knew they had been in danger. There were times when equipment just worked better than it should have, when systems that were supposed to fail kept running, when communication stayed clear in areas where they should have been jammed, he told her during a conversation that took place while she worked on his transmission. We never knew why, but word gets around eventually. People talk and stories get passed down, and eventually you realize that someone was out there making sure we had what we needed to come home. The respect that active-duty personnel showed for Sarah's background extended beyond simple recognition of military service. These were people who understood the difference between conventional military operations and the kind of classified work that Omega Force had conducted. They recognized that her skills represented capabilities that existed at the absolute pinnacle of military technical expertise, and their interactions with her carried the weight of professional acknowledgement between specialists who operated at the highest levels of their respective fields. Colonel Patricia Williams, the commanding officer of the base's technical maintenance squadron, made an unofficial visit to Murphy's shop to observe Sarah's work and offer her a position as a civilian contractor providing specialized training to military technicians. We have equipment that requires the kind of expertise that can't be taught through conventional training programs, Colonel Williams explained during a conversation that took place away from the other mechanics. Personnel with your background and capabilities are extremely rare, and the knowledge you possess could benefit an entire generation of military technicians who are dealing with increasingly complex systems. Sarah's response to the offer revealed something about her motivations for choosing civilian life over the continued application of her military expertise. "I appreciate the recognition, Colonel," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "But I've found satisfaction in work that helps individual people solve immediate problems without the weight of strategic consequences or classified implications. There's something peaceful about fixing a family's car so they can get to work safely, without having to consider whether success or failure might influence geopolitical situations or affect operations that I can't discuss." The philosophical difference between her military career and her civilian work was something that Sarah began to articulate more openly as she became comfortable with people knowing about her background. Military operations, especially classified operations, require you to think about consequences that extend far beyond the immediate task, she explained to Murphy during a conversation about her career transition. Every decision has strategic implications. Every technical choice might affect other operations, and every mistake could compromise missions that involve hundreds of people. Civilian automotive work lets me focus on the immediate problem without having to consider secondary effects or classify my knowledge based on security implications. The therapeutic value of working on civilian vehicles became more apparent as Sarah discussed her transition from military to civilian life. "When someone brings me a car that won't start, the problem is contained and definable," she said. I can diagnose the issue, fix it, and the customer drives away with a solution that improves their life in a direct and measurable way. There are no classified implications, no strategic considerations, and no long-term consequences that require ongoing monitoring or security review. The satisfaction is immediate and complete. But the revelation of her background also created new challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she had chosen the anonymity of small-town automotive work. Military families began seeking her out specifically, sometimes driving considerable distances to have their vehicles serviced by someone whose reputation had become known throughout the regional military community. These customers brought with them expectations and assumptions about the level of service that someone with her background should provide, and they often requested modifications or repairs that went beyond the scope of routine automotive maintenance. The attention also attracted the interest of military contractors and defense industry companies who recognized the value of her expertise for civilian applications. Representatives from aerospace companies, defense contractors, and technology firms began making inquiries about her availability for consulting work, offering compensation packages that far exceeded what she could earn as an automotive mechanic. These offers forced Sarah to repeatedly explain that her choice of civilian work was intentional and represented a deliberate decision to step away from the high-stakes, technical challenges that had defined her military career. The most unexpected consequence of the revelation was the impact it had on her relationships with the other mechanics at Murphy's shop. Tommy Reeves, who had been the unofficial leader among the technical staff, found himself deferring to Sarah's judgment on complex problems even though she had never sought any kind of supervisory role. Jake Morrison began asking questions about technical procedures and diagnostic techniques that went far beyond the scope of routine automotive work, seeking to learn from someone whose expertise encompassed systems and technologies that civilian mechanics rarely encountered. Luis Hernandez, whose specialization in diesel systems had made him the shop's expert on commercial vehicle maintenance, discovered that Sarah's knowledge of diesel technology included experience with military diesel systems that incorporated modifications and capabilities that civilian engines didn't possess. Their conversations about fuel injection systems, turbocharging technologies, and electronic engine management became opportunities for Luis to learn about technological developments that were years ahead of what was available in civilian applications. Changes in workplace dynamics were subtle but significant. Sarah's opinions on technical matters carried more weight than they had when her background was unknown, and other mechanics began consulting with her on problems that they might have previously attempted to solve independently. She found herself in the uncomfortable position of being recognized as the most knowledgeable person in the shop while trying to maintain the collaborative relationships that had made her civilian work environment comfortable and satisfying. Murphy himself struggled with how to manage an employee whose capabilities so dramatically exceeded the technical demands of routine automotive repair. He wanted to recognize her expertise and provide opportunities for her to apply her skills more fully, but he also respected her stated preference for work that was straightforward and free from the complications that had characterized her military career. The challenge was finding ways to acknowledge her extraordinary background, while supporting her choice to use those capabilities in ordinary applications. The broader community's reaction to news of Sarah's background was a mixture of pride, curiosity, and respect that reflected the general appreciation that civilians had for military service, amplified by the recognition that her specific contributions had been far beyond conventional military roles. Local business owners began treating her with a deference that was both gratifying and somewhat uncomfortable, and community leaders suggested ways that her expertise might benefit local organizations and institutions. The American Legion Post in Fort Braxton invited her to speak at their monthly meeting about her experiences, an invitation that Sarah declined politely but firmly, explaining that operational details remained classified and that she preferred to let her military service remain in the past. The local high school's automotive program requested her assistance in developing curriculum that would prepare students for military technical careers, a request that she considered more seriously because it offered a way to share knowledge without compromising security requirements or returning to the high-pressure environment of classified work. Veterans organizations throughout the region began reaching out to Sarah, recognizing that her presence in the community represented an opportunity to connect with someone whose service embodied the highest levels of military achievement. These contacts were respectful and professional, but they also represented a level of attention and recognition that conflicted with the anonymity that had been one of the primary attractions of civilian life in a small town where her background and capabilities could remain hidden. The complexity of managing her public profile while maintaining her privacy became an ongoing challenge that required Sarah to develop new skills for dealing with attention that she had successfully avoided for years. The balance between acknowledging the respect that people wanted to show for her service and maintaining the personal boundaries that made civilian life satisfying required constant navigation and adjustment as her reputation spread throughout the military and civilian communities at the weight of unwanted attention and the erosion of the carefully constructed anonymity that had made civilian life bearable finally reached a tipping point on a humid Thursday morning in late August. Sarah arrived at Murphy's Auto Repair to find a news van parked outside the shop, complete with a satellite dish and a reporter who was interviewing Tommy Reeves about the decorated war hero who has been secretly working as a mechanic in their small town. The sight of cameras and microphones pointed at her workplace sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning and everything to do with the realization that her story was about to become public in ways that would make her current life impossible to maintain. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone bearing the logo of a regional television network, had apparently been tipped off by someone who understood the potential human interest value of Sarah's story. Military veteran transitions to civilian life were always popular news topics, but a former member of an elite classified unit working anonymously as an automotive mechanic in a small town had the kind of compelling narrative that could attract national attention. Sarah watched from her truck as the reporter gestured toward the shop while delivering what was obviously a prepared introduction for a story that would air on the evening news. The invasion of her privacy represented everything that Sarah had worked to avoid when she had chosen separation from military service over reassignment to conventional units. Omega Force personnel had been trained to value anonymity as a survival skill, to understand that recognition and public attention created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces who might want to target individuals with access to classified information. Even though her active military career was over, the instincts and security concerns that had been drilled into her during 18 months of intensive training remained as sharp as ever. Sarah made the decision that had been inevitable since General Harrison's visit had begun the process of unraveling her carefully constructed civilian identity. She drove past the news van without stopping, continued through town to her apartment above the hardware store, and began the methodical process of packing her life into the same duffel bags and storage containers that had accompanied her through a decade of military deployments. The process was familiar and efficient, representing skills that Omega Force personnel had mastered for situations where rapid departure might be necessary with minimal advance warning. The letter she left on Murphy's desk was brief and professional, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to work in an environment where her skills had been valued, without requiring explanation or justification. She thanked Murphy for providing a place where she could transition from military to civilian life, for allowing her to find satisfaction in work that helped individual people without the complications of strategic considerations or security implications. She recommended that Tommy Reeves be promoted to senior technician and suggested that Jake Morrison was ready for additional responsibilities that would help him develop his diagnostic capabilities. Her final task before leaving Murphy's auto repair was to complete the maintenance checklist for every vehicle that was currently in the shop, ensuring that all work was properly documented and that her colleagues would have the information they needed to complete any ongoing repairs. This attention to detail, even during her departure, reflected the professional standards that had characterized her entire career, both military and civilian. She left detailed notes about diagnostic procedures that might benefit her replacement, and recommendations for equipment upgrades that would improve the shop's efficiency and capabilities. The drive out of Fort Braxton took her past landmarks that had become familiar over 3 years of civilian life: the hardware store where she had rented her apartment, the library where she had spent quiet evenings reading technical manuals and automotive journals, the grocery store where she had shopped for simple meals that she prepared in her small kitchen. These ordinary places had provided the normalcy that she had sought after years of deployments to locations that couldn't be discussed and operations that officially had never occurred. Her destination was deliberately vague, representing the kind of operational security that Omega Force personnel maintained even in civilian situations. She had learned to avoid establishing patterns that could be predicted or destinations that could be anticipated, skills that translated naturally to a life where privacy and anonymity were valued more than community connections or long-term planning. The road ahead led toward a new town, a new job, and another attempt to find the balance between using her capabilities productively and maintaining the low profile that made civilian life sustainable. The phone calls began before she had traveled 50 miles from Fort Braxton. Murphy had discovered her letter and was trying to convince her to reconsider, offering increased compensation, modified responsibilities, and assurances that he could manage the media attention in ways that would protect her privacy. Tommy Reeves called to express his regret about the news coverage and to ask if there was anything he could do to address the situation that had prompted her departure. Jake Morrison's message was simple but heartfelt, thanking her for the knowledge she had shared and expressing hope that she would find the peace that she was seeking. General Harrison's call came that evening, while Sarah was setting up a temporary camp in a state park that provided the kind of isolation where she could think through her next steps without interference. The general's tone was apologetic, acknowledging that his visit to Murphy's shop had initiated the chain of events that had made her position untenable. He offered resources for establishing a new identity in a location where her background would remain protected, but he also expressed concern about the broader implications of her situation for other Omega Force veterans who were attempting to build civilian lives. "The challenge that you're facing isn't unique," General Harrison explained during their conversation. "Personnel with classified backgrounds often discover that the skills and experiences that make them valuable also make them conspicuous when they try to blend into civilian communities. The recognition that should honor their service sometimes becomes the reason they can't find the peace that they've earned through their sacrifices." His words reflected an understanding of the contradictions that define post-military life for people whose service had involved capabilities and experiences that couldn't be easily explained or appropriately recognized. The conversation with General Harrison also revealed that Sarah's situation was being monitored by military and intelligence agencies that maintained ongoing responsibility for the security and welfare of former classified personnel. Her sudden departure from Fort Braxton had triggered security protocols that were designed to ensure that former Omega Force members weren't being targeted or exploited by hostile forces who might want to access the knowledge and capabilities that they possessed. This level of continued oversight was both reassuring and concerning, representing protection that came with the cost of never being completely free from military and governmental influence. The moral lesson that emerged from Sarah's story was complex and multifaceted. reflecting the challenges that faced all individuals whose capabilities and experiences placed them outside the normal ranges of civilian life. Her situation demonstrated that exceptional skills and extraordinary service created their own form of burden, that recognition and appreciation could become obstacles to the simple, ordinary life that many veterans sought after careers spent in high-stakes, high-pressure environments where their unique abilities were constantly demanded and tested. The response from the Fort Braxton community to news of Sarah's departure was immediate and emotional. Letters began arriving at Murphy's Auto Repair from customers who wanted to express their gratitude for her work and their regret that media attention had driven her away from a place where she had found satisfaction and purpose. Military families who had benefited from her expertise wrote about the ways that her technical knowledge and professional integrity had exceeded their expectations and provided them with confidence in the reliability of their vehicles. Veterans organizations throughout the region issued statements acknowledging the service and sacrifice represented by Sarah's story while criticizing the media coverage that had violated her privacy and made her civilian life unsustainable. These organizations understood that the transition from military to civilian life was challenging under the best circumstances, and they recognized that the special circumstances of classified service created additional complications that required sensitivity and respect from the communities that these veterans chose to join. The automotive industry professionals who had worked with Sarah also responded to her departure with recognition of the exceptional knowledge and capabilities that she had brought to civilian mechanical work. Technical training schools began incorporating lessons from her diagnostic techniques into their curricula, and automotive repair shops throughout the region adopted maintenance procedures that reflected the systematic approaches that she had demonstrated during her time at Murphy's shop. The broader lesson of Sarah Mitchell's story extended beyond the specific challenges faced by veterans with classified backgrounds to encompass the universal truth that strength and capability often choose to remain hidden rather than seeking recognition or acclaim. Her decision to work as an automotive mechanic rather than pursuing career opportunities that would have fully utilized her extraordinary skills demonstrated that true expertise was often more concerned with finding satisfaction and purpose than with achieving status or compensation that reflected the full value of exceptional capabilities. The transformation of perspective that her story created in everyone who encountered it reflected the importance of recognizing that ordinary appearances often concealed extraordinary backgrounds, that quiet competence might represent capabilities that exceeded anything that could be imagined, and that respect and appreciation should be offered to all individuals regardless of how they chose to apply their skills and experience. The mechanics, customers, and community members who had known Sarah as simply an exceptionally skilled automotive technician learned that judgment based on appearances was invariably incomplete and often profoundly inaccurate. Her story became a reminder that the most significant contributions to community welfare and individual well-being often came from people who sought no recognition for their efforts, who found satisfaction in work that helped others without requiring explanation or justification, and who applied extraordinary capabilities to ordinary challenges because they valued the peace and normalcy that such work provided. The true measure of strength, her example suggested, was not the willingness to demonstrate capabilities publicly, but the wisdom to know when those capabilities were best applied quietly, efficiently, and without fanfare. The final lesson that emerged from Sarah Mitchell's brief presence in Fort Braxton was that some individuals carried burdens and possessed capabilities that required understanding and protection from the communities that benefited from their presence. Recognition and appreciation, while well-intentioned, could sometimes become obstacles to the very peace and normalcy that these individuals sought, creating situations where gratitude had to be balanced against respect for the privacy and autonomy that made civilian life sustainable for people whose service had involved sacrifices that extended far beyond what most people could imagine or appreciate. 3 months later, a small automotive shop in rural Montana quietly opened for business. The sign read Mountain View Auto Repair, and the owner was listed simply as Cess Mitchell, Certified Technician. No fanfare, no media attention. Just another mechanic ready to help people get back on the road. The first customer was a local rancher whose truck had been making strange noises. Sarah listened for exactly 30 seconds, then smiled and said, "Loose heat shield on the exhaust manifold. 20-minute fix." The rancher watched in amazement as she diagnosed and repaired the problem with the same methodical precision that had once saved lives in classified operations halfway around the world. Word spread quickly through the small mountain community, but this time it was different. These were people who understood the value of privacy, who respected someone's choice to live quietly, and who measured worth by actions rather than words. Sarah had finally found her place, somewhere she could use her extraordinary skills to help ordinary people without the weight of recognition or the burden of unwanted attention. She kept the commemorative coin from General Harrison on her workbench, a reminder of who she had been and what she had accomplished. But every evening, as she locked up the shop and looked out at the mountains that surrounded her new home, she knew she had found something even more valuable than recognition: peace. The strongest people, her story proved, aren't always the ones standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the ones who choose to step back into the shadows, finding strength not in being known, but in knowing they've made a difference. If this story inspired you to look beyond appearances and recognize the quiet heroes around us, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that someone ordinary was actually extraordinary? Like this video if you believe true strength whispers while weakness shouts, and subscribe for more incredible stories of hidden heroes among us.